The Texas House passed a measure removing a school voucher-like program from a massive education funding bill. The amendment passed by a vote of 84 to 63, killing a program through which public dollars would have been used to fund a private education.
I support everything with one exception: the creation of ESAs or vouchers.
On the floor of the Texas House, State Rep John Rainey of College Station introduced an amendment that would essentially kill the push for vouchers.
I'm by no means a public education expert, but I believe in my heart that using taxpayer dollars to fund an entitlement program is not conservative, and it's bad public policy.
Rainey's amendment quickly garnered support from at least a dozen Republicans who signed the amendment, including Representative Travis Clardy of Nacogdoches. And while it had support, it also had opposition, sparking some heated moments in the lower chamber.
So if a school district has boys in the girls' locker room, which they can do, and I disagree with that policy, then you're telling me that those parents are locked into that school district.
Members, let's please retain some decorum here in the Texas House. Please remain from outbursts, including the gallery, which I will not hesitate in clearing the gallery if it happens again.
Proponents of the bill argue this would give parents the ability to choose, no matter their economic status, with $10,500 set aside per student.
Is that higher or lower than the average private school cost in tuition? I understand it's around $9,700. Is that correct?
Yes.
So it's lower. Okay.
There are Texas families, to no fault of anyone, who things just aren't working. Maybe a child with special needs. They may be a child that is being bullied. Or maybe a child that for some reason that experience is just not serving them well. They're not advancing in a way that parents want.
And again, the House eventually voted to take those education savings accounts out of the bill. The three East Texas lawmakers voting in favor of that measure to eliminate that program were Republicans Travis Clardy of Nacogdoches, Jay Dean of Longview, and Gary Van Dever of New Boston. Governor Greg Abbott has said he will veto this bill without that measure.